In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the dissolve part command. Now, dissolving a part is going to take a MIDI track and separate it into separate pitches or separate MIDI channels. And this is really cool to do on drum parts. For example, these events all have multiple notes inside of them. And since it's a drum track, it means that all of those events are playing different sounds. But what if we wanted each individual drum sound on its own track? Well, that's where dissolve part comes in. And there's two basic outcomes of the dissolve part command. And let's go over each one, because both of them are going to require that you select all of the events on the track that you want to use the dissolve part command on. So I'm going to right-click on our drum track and select all of the events on that track. And then under the MIDI pull-down menu, I'm going to select dissolve part, and I'm going to see the dissolve part dialog box. Now, if there were multiple channels, in other words, multiple MIDI channels on a track, like on a standard MIDI file that you might import into Cubase that you download from the internet, and all of that information is on one part but separate channels, what you can do here is separate that one track with all of the channels in it to separate channels so that each individual instrument is on its own track. But since these events all have the same MIDI channel in them, the separate channels is not an option. There's only one channel, so it can't separate that. But what it can separate are the pitches. And since drum patches all have individual notes representing different sounds on a drum set, we can use this command to separate them onto new tracks. And then by default, the optimized display is turned on, but I'm actually going to have you check this little box first, which is called dissolve to lanes. This is something new in Cubase 6 that works with the comping feature that has been added. So what I'm going to do is check that one, which is automatically checked the optimized display for us. You can't uncheck it if you're dissolving to the lanes, and that's just fine. So with dissolve to lanes checked, I'm going to show you this first method for dissolving these MIDI parts. So when I hit OK, here's what happens, is the MIDI information from those source events gets separated into their own lanes. For example, if we solo this lane, now the snare drum is on its own lane. The hi-hats are on their own lane, and so forth. So we've got those lanes all containing their own MIDI notes. And that way you can keep track and edit individual drum notes on their own separate lanes. And the other advantage to working with lanes is that you can just disable the lanes to fold all of those events back up into one track. You'll see that with all of those lanes open, it really starts to take a lot of screen real estate on your project window. So if you dissolve into lanes, you're just able to close up those lanes really quickly. And then if you want to edit those parts, just open the lanes and edit the parts that appear on each individual lane. But there's one advantage to doing it the other method, where you actually create brand new channels for every single note. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that dissolve part command by typing Command Z. That will get us right back to before we dissolve the part and leave all of the events still highlighted. And then I'm going to go back to the dissolve part command, and this time I'm not going to dissolve to lanes. I'm going to leave the optimized display checked, and I'm still going to be separating the pitches. However, this time it's going to make all new channels for every single note. So when I click OK, what happens is that standard drum kit gets loaded several times as new tracks, but only one note per track. So I'm going to scroll down here, and you can see that every single channel has the rock standard kit loaded onto it, but then every event is separated into separate pitches. So when I play this back, it's going to sound identical. Let me just solo those tracks by turning on the solo lights for just those tracks. See, it sounds the same, but the biggest advantage to using this method is that since it loads a new virtual instrument for every single track, when we go into the mixer by typing F3, you'll see that it loaded brand new instrument tracks, and each one has their own separate fader and EQ settings and insert effects and so forth. So every one of those drum events is now handled as a separate audio channel. Let me show you what I mean. If I play back, let's just solo these one by one. Here is our bass drum, which is C1. Here is, well, there's nothing on there right now. If we come back, there's the hi-hat track, snare drum track. So if I wanted to EQ the snare drum separately, I can do that now without affecting the other tracks because they all have their own separate independent mixer channel. The only disadvantage to doing it this way is that you are going to be opening up new instruments, which will drive your computer a little bit harder, and plus all of these tracks are now not easily folded into the original track, which has all been muted out, just in case you were wondering. That's why these are all muted out, because the original track won't play anymore. But it leaves it so that you can unmute these events if you want to at a later time. But since we do have all these new tracks, it might be a good idea to create a folder track and stick all of those new tracks inside of the folder. So I'm going to select this first track and go under the Project pull-down menu and select Folder. And then I'm going to call this drums, and I'm going to actually move that to the top of the list. Then I'm going to click the first track and then shift click the last track to select all of them. And now I'm going to click and drag up until I see that little green arrow, then lift off of my mouse button. Now all of those tracks are in the drum folder, and I can click on the folder icon to fold them all inside of their own track. And that just helps to keep the screen real estate to a minimum. If I wanted to go in and edit any of those events, I just open the folder again, and now all of those segments are visible. Then to close the folder, just click the folder icon again, and that will put them back inside of that folder track. Now in the next few videos, I'm going to show you how to add MIDI events without a MIDI keyboard.